New clause NC1, exemption agriculture.
The question is that new clause 1 be read a second time. John Penrose.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motions that stand in mine and my honourable friend's name. Can I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that there is a great deal to support about this bill, and I think I mentioned this at second reading as well. This is a vitally important bill, not just because it is required under the terms of our leaving the EU, but because it does some very important things to the way that the future subsidy control regime will be applied. And we've already heard that the central set of principles are absolutely crucial, and also the notion of pre-approval and allowing things to be done at pace to create a much less bureaucratic, much more nimble, much more predictable regime is overall, I think, hugely to be welcome, and something which I hope everyone will be able to sign up to. It also, Madam Deputy Speaker, means that I hope we will be able to move to a principle where we have as few exemptions and exceptions to our subsidy control regime as possible. It is absolutely essential that you have a subsidy control regime which doesn't allow loopholes through which I'm sure the current minister would never dream of doing such a thing, but through which perhaps some less principled future government might try to drive any sort of measures through which might either involve cronyism or which might also involve economic distortions of any kind. So it is essential that there are as minimal loopholes and that it covers as evenly and as predictably as possible the entire economy. It is no accident, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this country has one of the lowest levels of public subsidies been granted in recent years under the old regime, which we were under the EU's guise. And I think that should be for free marketeers amongst us, for those of us who care about economic efficiency and economic productivity. That should be a source of pride and something which we should not be trying to overturn or to change in future either. It's a point, in fact, which I made in the Government Commission review, which I was asked to do recently about competition policy, which has a chapter specifically about subsidy control and says less is definitely more. It is far better to do less in this area to make sure that, therefore, there is more space for companies, for business leaders to compete on the basis of their abilities of their organisations, of the quality of their products and services, rather than because of who they know in government and how much rent and subsidies they can wring out of political connections as a result. Absolutely essential that we remember this, that we adhere to it, and that we persist with it as much as we possibly can. And the final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, about why this is crucial is because this done right, this bill done right, ought to be one of the major pieces of post-Brexit dividends which we should be seeking to achieve as a result of our leaving the EU. If we get this right, it allows us to have, as I said, a faster, a more nimble, a much more economically rational way of dealing with subsidies, which keeps the best of the objectivity which everyone said we had under the EU, but does it in a faster, more digitally enabled and just generally more modern, less bureaucratic, less covered in red tape fashion. And so, therefore, a post-Brexit dividend is here for the taking. It is waiting for us to pick it up off the table, providing we can only do it correctly. And my concern, my reason for tabling the amendments in my name and those of my honourable friends here today is because, while it does an awful lot of this right, I worry that we may be about to make one crucial and critical error. And we've already heard some of the points made in the lady from Aberdeen North, spokeswoman for the SNP, making the point about transparency. It's all very well to pre-approve. It's all very well to have this more flexible, this faster, this more nimble approach. But that faster and more nimble approach will only work if we have the army of armchair auditors who can spot when something is going wrong and say, hang on a second, this is a marvellous principle, but it isn't being adhered to in this specific case. And if we can't see it, we can't do that. None of us here, or indeed in our constituencies, or indeed the journalists who pore over these things as well, nobody will be able to do that until it is too late. And in a digitising economy, Madam Deputy Speaker, speed matters too. Because otherwise, if you can't do this until it's too late, or you can't do it at all, what you end up with is companies being driven out of business And by the time the rubble is left of their business, by the time the jobs have been lost, by the time the investment has been foregone, at that point it's too late to come back 2 years later, or even 8 months later in some cases for fast-moving sectors, and say, oh, we're terribly sorry we got this wrong. You need to be able to move fast and rapidly and to pick it up as soon as you possibly can. And that is why I'm moving these amendments, if I can.
Yeah, I'm very grateful. I mean, it's a very, very strong point about the armchair auditors particularly. And this happened in the US when the US published all their loans under their version of the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme called the Paycheck Protection Programme, all loans of £150,000. As soon as they did that, £30 billion of that money was paid straight back to the Treasury, to the US Treasury, on the basis they didn't want that visibility because they'd someone take that money, not fraudulently, but perhaps inappropriately.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. He makes a very, very good point. And for those of us who therefore worry about the scale of subsidies and, as I said earlier, take pride in the fact that we are a relatively low-subsidy country, a low-subsidy economy, and we want it to stay that way because we care about competitiveness and making sure that people are competing just on the basis of their ability to please their customers rather than on the ability of who they know in government. That has to be the right approach. And the American example is a really good one about how transparency can drive down the level of subsidy. I will be fascinated to see, incidentally, how that applies in other countries such as Spain, which have a very, very low level of declarations and a low threshold of declarations and therefore a high level of declarations, to make sure we'll be able to sort of follow that very carefully. I give way.
I'm very grateful for my old friend giving way, and he is, and I very rarely say this in Parliament, he's actually making a very useful speech. Not about him, I mean just generally speeches here. Anyway, my point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is does my honourable friend agree that one of the things, the value of his amendments is that it does increase the number of pieces of information we have, and that the government is missing something here about the value of predictive analytics on the way in which subsidies are working or are not working, that could then be applied to other areas of government expenditure?
Absolutely right. I mean, the point about transparency is, yes, of course, it is to try and improve the productivity of our economy, and yes, of course, it is to avoid distortions of our economy, and yes, of course, it is also to try and reduce cronyism as well. But he's absolutely right to say there is a further, more longer-term benefit, which is you can then tell whether or not the subsidies that you're offering are any good. Are they actually having the effect you want them to have? Can you learn from that? And there is a long and ignoble history, I'm afraid, and we can all see this. We can all quote examples from governments of all political types and stripes in history of politicians just getting it wrong and not learning, but extra data might very well do so. The old phrase that politicians are terrible at picking winners, but losers are really good at picking politicians, I'm afraid applies here in spades, and data and objectivity is absolutely essential as a way to sort of try and prick that bubble and avoid that happening again. And the good news, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that ministers get it. Ministers are clear about the value of transparency. They've said so to me and to others. In fact, the Minister said to me in a letter earlier on December, he said, transparency is fundamental, not only to the future subsidy control regime, but also to good governance more widely. Absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker. So the principle is clear. There is no disagreement right the way across this House, on all sides of this House, that this is the right thing to do. So, why aren't we doing it then? Because the problem with it is, as I think it's been covered partly in committee, but it bears repeating here strongly and forcefully, is that the EU regime, which this is supposed to supplant, has a series of transparency declaration thresholds that say you've got to declare everything over €500,000. There are other thresholds too for cumulative grants, which we heard about in the lady from Aberdeen North's speech. But €500,000 is kind of the basic threshold. And this bill says that you have to declare anything over £500,000. Now, unless the exchange rate has gone completely doolally in the last 10 minutes, that's a much higher level, or moderately higher level, than the €500,000. And as a result, we will be declaring fewer subsidies under this transparency regime in future than we were in the past, in spite of the fact that ministers quite rightly have said that transparency is absolutely essential and an absolutely core principle, and we all agree with it. So we are not delivering on the central principle which everybody agrees should be done. And that's why I've tabled three basically groups of amendments. They do three things, some of which we've already heard, so I won't go through the detail again because the lady from Aberdeen North summarised it nicely. But the first group is talking about amounts and saying, look, we don't have to declare anything over £500,000. We should be much, much more transparent than that. If we are really serious about trying to be world-class about this, let's knock 3 zeros off that number. Let's go for £500 instead. What have we got to hide? What have we got to be scared of? Why don't we just put it all out there and let people see? And at that point, it would be transformational for the reasons that I've just described.
Thank Marlon for giving way, and he's making a very good speech and some very good points. On the issue of transparency just raised, surely it would actually be cheaper as well as more transparent to do exactly what he says, because when we have effectively a digital system that will put these things together, it actually costs more money and time and reduces the productivity of the staff who are doing this if they have to sift through what meets a certain threshold. Why not, as he said, just put everything out there?
Yeah. Absolutely right. My honourable friend makes a very important point. And equally, the point about the cost goes more broadly than that too, because we heard before about the cumulative threshold, where if you end up with multiple different grant applications or subsidies that have been received by a single company, and they collectively over 3 years go above, I think it's £315,000, then that's supposed to be declared, but how is it going to be declared? Because the company is supposed to keep the letters, but it hasn't necessarily got a duty to declare it, and the different subsidy granting organisations, be they local authorities around the country or whatever they may be, won't necessarily know to talk to each other, and they won't know for another year in some cases, or at least 6 months, whether or not someone else has made those grants. It would be enormously simpler, Madam Deputy Speaker, if instead of all that we just said, do you know what, if it's more than 500 quid, put it on the subsidy database, within a month, then everybody can see if you're about to grant another subsidy, you just got to look at the subsidy database and it's there for everyone to see. You know if they're going to go over a threshold, you know what else they've got, and you can do the comparison really easily and simply if you like. It would also, though, to my honourable friend's point, cut costs not just amongst the granting organisations, the subsidy dishers outers, it would also cut costs very dramatically in the subsidy receivers too, because all of a sudden you don't have to worry about whether or not you've got all the letters with all the subsidies that you've been granted by Aberdeen North, by Aberdeen City Council and Aberdeen Shire Council as well. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to keep them anymore. This isn't a burden that is going to be on your business. It's going to be something which isn't a burden at all because it's on the subsidy database. So we are creating, as the bill currently stands, a burden on businesses which we don't have to, which we can easily reduce and remove completely with this one simple measure.
I agree with him, and thank him for giving way. But do you agree that there's actually a general presumption if you're receiving money effectively from the taxpayer, there should be more transparency over that? We can have the strange situation where I'm doing grass cutting for my local council and get paid £600, that invoice gets published by the council on their database. You know, I could be receiving tens of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money and that not get published. That surely can't be the right balance for this situation.
Absolutely right. And while I appreciate that there is a technical distinction between amounts of subsidy and amounts of just general local authority spend, it's a very, very strong comparison, I would argue, to say if it's worthwhile recording £500 spend of anything for your local council, why are subsidies so special? Why should subsidies be different? If anything, because of the scope for potential cronyism and other concerns, if anything, we should be tougher on subsidies than we are on other kinds of spending as well. So, yes, absolutely, let's at least make the thresholds all the same at £500, and at that point there can be no concern or worry about it too. So the amount, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the first group of amendments. The second collection of amendments we've already heard a little bit about from the lady from Aberdeen North is about speed. And I've already mentioned that in today's digitising economy, publishing details of a subsidy 2 years later, potentially, or almost 2 years later, even 6 months later, in a digitising economy can be way too late. A company can have gone under if it's been faced by a heavily subsidised, successfully heavily subsidised competitor in their local area. Jobs will have been destroyed, wealth would have been destroyed, investment will have been foregone, and most importantly of all, or more generally rather, the reputation of that particular local economy as a free, fair, sensible, level playing field place to do business will have been damaged as well. Clearly, speed matters today, and it's going to matter more and more and more as our economy moves faster through digitisation. And so, therefore, it makes no sense at all to allow 6 months, and in some cases even longer, in order to allow declarations of those subsidies to take place. Most subsidies, because when you dish one out, you have to send a letter to the person receiving that subsidy, you could just put that subsidy onto the database at the same time as you're sending the letter in the first place. You could probably do it electronically if you got the right interface going anyway. And it could happen, I'm suggesting a month. I would argue it could probably happen within days, but let's be generous, let's be kind, let's give people a little bit of space. Let's say it's going to be a month. And I would just expand a little bit on the point about tax-related subsidies. Because it is true, as we heard earlier, that a tax-related subsidy can take almost 2 years under the current proposals in order to be recorded and to become clearly visible and transparently visible. And I can't see any reason why that should be the case, not just for tax-related subsidies, but for anything else at all either. In general, for most tax-related subsidies, you can do it immediately because you know the value with some certainty right up front. If I'm giving someone a subsidy because it's a reduction on their local business rates, I know how much the value of that subsidy is going to be on the day it comes out. So I can put that out on the subsidy database right there, right there. The same will go for most other kinds of tax-related subsidies. Tax on your VAT, subsidies on your VAT, subsidies on whatever it might be. It's only a very small number of tax-related subsidies where there would be uncertainty for any length of time. And as we've already heard, and I think it's absolutely right, it is perfectly possible to come up with a good estimate to begin with. And I don't think it works. I don't think it is an adequate piece of logic to turn around and say, well, because we don't know precisely what this particular subsidy amount will be, therefore we shouldn't reveal it at all. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is making the best the enemy of the good. And the trouble with it is that if you make the best the enemy of the good and say, and therefore we're not going to put anything out, you don't end up with the best and you don't end up with a good, you end up with something which is actually pretty dreadful because you're keeping it secret for up to 2 years. How does that make sense when you can, as we've already heard, estimate it very, very accurately? And in fact, in many cases, these things are done in bands, and you can certainly say what it'll be roughly in that band at the very least. And even if you get it wrong, you can still correct it later on, but people know it's there, people know what it was, and then people know how much roughly it will have been, and that will have allowed challenge if necessary.
Will you be quick?
Happily.
Just specifically on the issue of uploading subsidies to databases, in terms of challenging these subsidies, the only way in which a subsidy would be overturned anyway is if the subsidy was given incorrectly, if the subsidy was against subsidy control principles or was distortive in some way. So surely this has no effect on the vast majority of subsidies. It just means that they're uploaded much quicker. But in the cases of subsidies that are wrong, that are bad, that are going to cause problems, surely the quickest possible time would be better to be able to see them.
Absolutely right. And it isn't just whether or not a particular subsidy breaches those principles. As she rightly pointed out, it's also a question about whether or not we can then spot whether or not there is a pattern of cronyism emerging. If a particular local council is giving out grants to its mates, you can see that much faster. That may not be something which is breaching the subsidy control principle, but you can bet your bottom dollar that people will want to know about that, and there will be the most almighty stink being created. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, brings me on to my final final amendment in the three groups that I mentioned, and that is the ability to challenge and check individual items, individual examples of a subsidy within a broader subsidy scheme. At the moment, if you register a subsidy scheme under the terms of this bill, and then you dish out subsidies under that subsidy scheme, and you basically ignore the terms of the subsidy scheme, you misapply them in some terrible way, either because of cronyism or because or you're just doing a bad job, or for whatever reason, or even fraudulently, nobody under the terms of this bill can challenge the individual decisions being made.
Absolutely.
And that cannot be right. That seems daft, Madam Deputy Speaker. And so all I'm saying is, look, you need to be able to challenge individual examples within a broader scheme. Otherwise, this transparency mechanism and challenge mechanism will be fundamentally flawed. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, that's the modest proposal. So far, I have not heard a single argument which unpicks the logic of this. As far as I can see, there are 3 departments of government with a dog in this fight. There is Lord Frost, who's in charge of Brexit dividend. He ought to be thoroughly in favour of this. He should be thoroughly in favour of this because of the opportunity which it offers. There's also the Secretary of State for Bays in here briefly just now. I hope he'll be back later on, who, of course, is a good free marketeer and is thoroughly committed to improving productivity. So he should be in favour of this too. And finally, there's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is the guardian of taxpayers' money. And as I just said, we should be taking pride with the fact that we are one of the least heavily subsidising economies in the developed world, certainly in when we're part of the EU, and we should be taking pride in that. I cannot see that he's going to be objecting to it either. And so therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I sit down, I would just ask the Minister to please explain what the logic is that explains why any of these arguments that not just I but others have been advancing. What's the logic behind this? And can you please explain who on earth thinks this is a bad idea? Because I can't find them, I can't see them, I don't think anybody knows who they are.
Did you block?